It is a beautiful day in Cleveland. Welcome to Sharing a Bowl with, presented by Superior Pho. I am your host, Chris Wynn, and today we'll be sharing a bowl with Dr. Kirsten Ellenbogen, CEO of the Great Lakes Science Center. Dr. Ellenbogen, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to be doing this. This is my favorite place, so sitting down and talking is the best. And call me Kirsten.
Kirsten, thank you so much. We're honored to have you today because the Great Lakes Science Center is such a monumental facet of Cleveland's landscape. It's really hard to talk about Cleveland as a tourist destination without mentioning it. So we're really, really excited to have you on. We're incredibly blessed to have the brilliant mind who makes it all work on our podcast today.
Thank you.
So, Kirsten, I want to know more about your story. Can you sort of tell us your origin story? How did it all begin for you?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a household where my parents, particularly my mother, who loves science, who does love science, was very patient with the messes we would make, doing random chemistry experiments or building things in the basement at the tool bench. My grandfather, though, was a lawyer, and I had that in mind. I come from a big family. There were 10 of us, and I like to argue and make my point, and I thought that's where I was headed. So truly, I have to give a lot of credit to Mrs. Benson, who was my 10th grade biology teacher, who tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you should apply for this." And it was a program for women and minorities in Detroit public schools to get paid jobs, nicely paid jobs, I must say. I was working at Jeans and Things after school and on the weekends at the time, and this job was definitely going to pay more than that. And you could apply to work at a lab around Detroit.
Oh, wow.
And do research. It was such an extraordinary opportunity. So I did the application, and I will admit I was in it a little more for being able to earn a little more money than I was for, this will be great and it'll help me go into a science career, because I was still sure that I was going to go and be a lawyer. And, it's that tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, "Have you considered this? I think this would be a good fit for you." I'm definitely here because many people have taken the time to do that for me. I'm quite sure I would not be in this job, and I'm quite sure I wouldn't be in a STEM career if not for people asking me, "Have you considered," or "This is a good fit," and taking the time to make me feel like I belong somewhere.
I see. And how did your grandfather take it when you told him you were no longer going to do law?
Oh, you know what? It worked out just fine. My grandfather had passed on many years before, and I had, relatives in law, but everyone was excited about me going into science.
Oh, good. So coincidentally, one of our other podcast guests, Jimmy Longo, was also starting law and then ended up somewhere else.
It's something you grow up thinking, right? You grow up thinking you can be a lawyer, a doctor, a dentist. Kids grow up, even today, with a pretty limited sense of what you can do as an adult. It's why we have to spend so much time getting in front of kids and their parents to say, hey, the world is full of a wild and wonderful range of jobs, and you have a lot of opportunities in front of you.
Right. No, I felt the same way actually when I graduated high school, and even going to college, I still had no idea what I really wanted to do. Which is actually how I ended up in business, studied finance, because I didn't know what I wanted to do and heard that it was lucrative. But I think you're right. A lot of kids don't have a sense of what all is out there. So I guess that kind of brings us to your work now, right?
Sure.
With the Great Lakes Science Center, what drives your work is what we consider learning. I think I have you quoted as saying, you've changed what counts as learning. What does that mean to you, and how has it shaped your life's work?
Sure. So growing up, I was not the perfect student. I enjoyed learning a lot. I loved reading. I still love reading.
I can relate to that first part.
Right? Yeah, right. And there are so many of us where the classroom wasn't necessarily a perfect fit. And if you look at education degrees and education research from 50 years ago, there was not a lot of attention being paid to the, learning ecosystem, the fact that all of us exist in an intertwined world where we learn through a lot of different experiences. And so there are things we learn from our parents, right? They're our first teachers, without a doubt. We learn from peers. We learn from people around us. We learn when we go to the library. We learn in after-school programs. We learn in religious programs, right? There are all these different interconnected groups, this learning ecosystem, it's called now. And a lot of my career has really been devoted to making that more visible, because as much as I could sit down with someone and they'd nod when I say, well, think about it. You do these things on the weekend and you learn from them, and you have this hobby and you learn from that. Those are all learning. Like, what counts as learning? It's not just what happens in school. And the field has definitely been changing over the last 50 years. So
The field of education.
the field of education, yeah. And so when I started on my doctorate in education, so I did an undergraduate program in what's called Great Books. So at the University of Chicago, you would hone in on a topic or a question that meant a lot to you, that you thought was a critical question to study. And mine was about this intersection of the philosophy of how people think you learn and the neurology of, and biological basis for change, in the neuronal structures and what that means. And do the two have anything to do with each other? And so you study that both through coursework, right? So I took education classes and neurology classes, and I worked in a neuroimmunology lab. But then I also read books, great books about the topic. So Plato's Meno or Descartes' Discourse on a Method, even The Tempest, So you read a range of great books, and your program was very structured around that, and the ability to answer and address these questions through your 4 years of college, or however many years of college you went through. And that did a lot to help me start to question, what is the biological basis of learning? How does that actually work in the brain? And then what are the different philosophies of education and understanding of education that drive things? Spent a lot of time studying John Dewey. And so when I went off and worked in museums for a while. I am going on a long tail now.
No, please.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
I was working in this terrific multiple sclerosis research lab. And this was the very early years of MS research, and the whole area of research we were doing, the field has taken a left turn and is looking at completely different things now. But at the time, we were a great lab. There's a lot of publications coming out of the lab. It was tremendous experience. But I still, in high school, I had gotten a little time working at what was then called the Detroit Science Center. It's now called the Michigan Science Center. And I would get time off in the summers to go work at a science museum. There were a lot in Chicago. And because it was an academic lab, you could do things like that, like get extra time off in the summer. And I kept going back to how much I enjoyed working in science museums. And I'd worked in natural history. I spent a summer in DC working in a children's museum, just getting this great mix of museum experiences. And eventually I got to a point of saying, I think I'm going to jump into the museum field. And so I did exhibit development. And these were the early years where, I had an email account when I was in college, but that's because I was taking stats, and it was a DARPA email account. And so I could email people at these, select group of other universities for my math class, when we'd stick our cards into the computer and figure all this out. But when I got to Museum of Science and Industry, my boss was really pleased. He was like, listen, I've gotten all of us in exhibits an email address because you're going to have to collaborate with a lot of people. But it was still super clunky to figure out how to use it at that point. And I remember doing this mix of phone calls and sending out these emails to all sorts of people that I didn't know and saying like, okay, well, I'm developing an exhibition on this topic, but how do you understand if people are learning what you intend them to learn when they're going through the exhibit? Like, I don't get it. How do you test for that? How do you measure that learning? And I got a lot of I don't knows, and a few people pointed me to a small number of researchers in the field. So all of that was a very long journey story to say I ended up sitting in a job where I found myself still asking all the time, yeah, but how do you know if they learned? You build these multi-million-dollar exhibitions. How do you know that people learned what you expected them to learn? And that sent me on a journey into learning research, into my doctorate, and eventually into the job I have today.
Wow. Well, and so is there any sort of short form answer of, how do you identify whether or not people have learned what you intended for them to learn?
Well, the first thing is to go into it with some clear goals. And when you're making your goals early on, let's stick with exhibits instead of programs for a minute. When you're making those goals about here's what I think someone will learn from the exhibit, you have to do what we call in the field front end evaluation. You have to get a sense of what do people already know. And if that's something like, one of our NASA related exhibits, well, there might be a little more public awareness and understanding of that, but that's very different from when we do a program or an exhibit on, say, blockchain, right? Which we have done, and it took so much more front end evaluation and research to figure out what do people understand and what don't they understand. And from there, we came up with goals for the programs and exhibits on those topics. And so a lot of it is a mix of, can the person talk about it in a coherent way? Sometimes the learning research is looking at whether or not they can apply it in a different area or apply what they've learned to a new challenge or take what they learn. I mean, this is a very engineering kind of focus at Great Lakes Science Center. We have quite a few exhibits where we design them to have a very low point of entry. So let's say it's the Derby Dash and you're building a car. Okay. It's very easy to build this car and you have all sorts of different ways to do it. So it's not hard to figure out, okay, great, I can build a car and then I'm going to bring it over here and put it on the racetrack. Now, if you want to make it go faster though, well, there's two sets of axles, they're different lengths, two different kinds of wheels, two different places where you can put the axle. There are little wells carved out in the car body where you can put different weights. You can do different lengths, right? So those, our learning philosophy is this low entry point, but very, very high ceiling. I mean, you can have an engineering degree and still spend hours and hours testing out different models. But for the exhibit, the important point is there's a way for you to measure, right, what you've just built. Did you get it down the track faster? Or for our wind turbine exhibit like that, how much energy did you generate from the wind turbine you designed? And then you go back and you iterate. You do it again and again and again.
That's beautiful.
So that's the kind of learning we're trying to measure at the Science Center, and we're really on the cutting edge of a lot of this work.
There's no limit on how long you can stay, is there? If I went now and spent like 6 hours, no one's going to come along and kick me out, is there?
Well, we do close at a certain time every night. And there are definitely, we have some members. I mean, these exhibits, our whole philosophy is really designed around having more people become members. Our business model, frankly, is designed around more people becoming members and coming back more frequently. And those exhibits fit into it. I mean, we have families that are there on such a regular basis that our staff all know their name. They know the names of our staff. It's a great place to
Oh,
come
wow.
back to all the time.
Is there, I don't want to get too technical, but is there any way to measure these metrics of engagement and real learning? Like, how do you establish that or
Yeah. So,
benchmark it?
I mean, there's a good part of my career was spent in evaluation and in really establishing what counts as learning in official ways. Like, so serving on a committee with the National Academy of Sciences and producing a book called, that really gets at what counts as learning, what does learning look like in these environments. And there, as you would expect, there are different ways to measure that kind of learning. So the really standard way to measure is, there's still a lot to be said for time on task, which we're, as a field, education in the classroom and education in museums, we're moving away from that. But that is one way that's still used as, do people use the exhibit or try out that activity for an extended amount of time? Better is when people can actually move into kind of explaining what they do. And we look for certain keywords. And in fact, even there's research that looks at gestures while people are explaining to see how much they understand of what they're talking about. So you could ask someone, for example, with Derby Dash is a good example of, well, what was it that made the car go faster? Did they get to it by accident or was it purposeful? And can they explain it?
Are there exit interviews?
So if we have a grant to create a new exhibit, for example,
Yeah.
we're often building into that some sort of evaluation or learning research. Any federal grant we get, for example, has to have an evaluation component of that. We're just working on a bunch of evaluation from the total solar eclipse, for example, and the grants we had related to that and doing evaluation. So, many of those grants, we have outputs, how many people participated, how long did they participate, things like that. But then there are the outcomes we're looking at where we really are measuring learning from a variety of different aspects.
That's incredible. I have so many technical questions, but I don't want to dig too deep into that. Speaking about children and learning, how do you facilitate STEM-based learning in your own household?
Yeah. So this question is a perfect segue into saying that my doctorate, I followed families who go to museums frequently. I wired them up with microphones, and then I analyzed how they talked about science and learning, both in museums, but also in other places where they were together talking as a family, which for some was at the dinner table or over homework. But I have data that I collected at barbershops and amusement parks and, think about it, libraries, other places that families go together and have conversations. And my work was really looking at how parents support learning conversations and whether or not the way that science centers are designed, is it effective at changing those conversations, like the learning conversations? So you can imagine with a dissertation like that, where I had more than 3,000 hours of parents having conversations with their children, made me hyper aware as a parent myself. I did that all before we had kids.
Oh, wow.
And so I will be honest and say that some of my parenting and being the educator that every parent is was related to taking a step back and not being the researcher that I am, and not overanalyzing.
Not turning your kids into an experiment?
Yes, exactly. So I will say I think I did pretty well at that. And it helps, my husband is an educator as well. He's an English teacher. So we certainly raised our children in a very learning-minded and learning-focused environment. And that starts, as all great learning does, with reading. And what I love is that we could raise our kids reading a wide variety of books. And when they were little, we were reading to them. And it was really important to me that they were always encouraged around being curious and exploring things, which also means an extraordinary amount of patience, right? I mean, the first experiments that children do are typically throwing things off their high chair again and again and again and again until you think you're going to lose your mind, right?
But they're just experimenting with gravity.
They are experimenting, and they would, of course, not call it gravity, but it's such an important part of a child's learning experience to really make those messes and explore and get into things that you would rather they don't, right? And setting up, lots of, the kids had a little toolkit of things that they could mess around with. Without necessarily causing serious damage, using the same toolkit that Charles and I would use, for example. So a lot of it was getting them exposed to things, being able to explore things, being given things. And I'm not saying I went and bought a fancy kit. Like, we actually went to the hardware store and bought a paint can, and then went through and just bought a lot of things that moved and had a hinge or spun, or right, all of
The
those
door stops and the locks and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Locks. There are a lot of locks, right? All those things that kids can just mess around with. That was a lot of it, and frankly, a lot of that I learned from researching some great parents who allowed me to study how they interacted with their own children. So that was a big part of it, and I will say neither of my children are ending up going into a STEM career so far. They're 17 and 19. So who's to say? We'll see. I mean, you and I, we've each taken our own career journeys. So it's hard to say when a child is still 17 or 19.
Right.
But we definitely raised kids who love to read, who love science and math. And that's a lot of what we wanted, was that they felt comfortable in any subject matter, and they felt confident that they could do it. And a lot of that was exposing them to things when they were young and making sure that they went to museums, that they got time outdoors, and that they felt comfortable in those environments and that they felt confident, right? So much of it is having the identity as someone who can do science and math, and never being the parent who says, oh, it's okay if you don't like that. I didn't like it either, right? But holding that back, even if that was the case for you, holding that back and really encouraging the child to figure out where they're really comfortable. For my daughter, it ended up being a love of chemistry that had to do with actually, facial products and things like that. I've really wanted to get in depth on what are the chemicals we're putting on us.
Our face.
Yeah, exactly. And found a chemistry teacher who was willing to support some of that.
Oh, wow.
So is she going into chemistry as a field right now? I don't think so. Is she really confident when she shops for products and dives into the chemical nature of different products? Yep. And I love it.
That's awesome. That is really awesome. Yeah, I asked the question because we have a lot of growing families and families that with young children that eat here, and some of the things that I've wondered as a fairly newer parent, what is the best way to facilitate learning in our household? And one of the best pieces of advice, and you've actually covered it yourself, is read to them. A lot of reading on a daily basis. And actually, that's one of the things that I didn't get growing up too much. I was lucky if my mom read to me on weekends. But I've heard just tremendous things about being consistent reading to your children. And then the other thing that you touched on, I think, was experiential learning, and putting the right things in front of your kids for them to touch and feel and see, and taking them to museums. What would you say if there were top 3 pieces of advice you'd give younger parents, what would you say the third one would be? First being reading, the second being exposing them to museums and exhibits and things that they can touch and feel.
And experiential learning. You said it really
Experiential.
well. Well, the third I would say is patience.
Just being patient.
Just being patient. And I had to even make little mantras for myself, which let me tell you, the kids are just, my youngest is just coming out of being, a full-on teenager, as teenagers should be. And I had moments where I was really going back to my neurology roots and reminding myself, they do not have a frontal lobe fully developed yet. They do not have a frontal lobe. They do not have a frontal lobe, to just remind myself that the filters that I expect a person to have is not what you should expect a child with a developing brain to have. For me, the way to stay patient was to constantly remind myself of the science of it. The majority of your brain development happens age 0 to 5, right? And just reminding myself of that, of just, they need lots of exposure to lots of things when they're that young, and to be patient about it, because it's going to be messy and incoherent or cause a tantrum or whatever it is to just, and let me be crystal clear, I was not patient all the time.
Okay.
I mean,
I don't feel as bad now.
oh gosh, no. I mean, I say this in hindsight, and the nice thing about having teenagers is then you get to practice it a second time, because they go back to some behaviors where you just think, wait, what?
Why did you do that?
Why did you do that? They do not have a frontal lobe yet. It's not fully developed. Just wait.
Until what age?
Things kind of really round out in the early 20s.
Oh, God.
But you see a lot of those behaviors. There's just like a chemical party going on in the brains of teenagers. And the more you can remind yourself that there's truly just a cacophony of chemical, electrical signals making a mess in that teenager's brain. For me, that was what helped me stay calmer in the moment and remember to practice that unconditional love, which, again, remember, I did not do that every time. But I would certainly say I did it the majority of the time, and only because I was reminding myself on a constant basis of, your child is testing things, right? When they're 3, they're testing things, and when they're 13, they're testing things, right? It's part of that learning process. And as much as it seems like the most inconsiderate or illogical activity, it's a learning activity. And that is a lot of what got me through with my sanity.
Got it.
Intact for the most part.
Okay. And any key mantras that, like, stay patient, stay patient?
Yeah, I mean, I think for all of us as parents, we've got to find the trigger that reminds us, right? And I mean, I've been to good talks about parenting where the emphasis was really on that, like, just chemical mess going on in your kid's head, and to remember that the chaos that you're experiencing in that moment is a reflection of truly the chaos that they're feeling in their minds at the moment, and to not judge that this is a coherent activity on the part of your child, but instead a genuine reflection of the mess that their brain is in at the moment, because it's in a serious development phase, and you need to give it time to develop, and put, little bits of guideposts around so they can only go so far without endangering themselves or making too much of a mistake.
So do you think being a parent has made your, how do I say it, your decision making and your exhibit development any I don't know, better is not the right word, but applicable, or like, did your experience as a parent help with the way you created exhibits?
Sure. I absolutely, I mean, I was an exhibit developer long before I had kids. Charles and I were married 12 years before we had kids because we were getting established at work and doing advanced degrees and living all over the world. And then we settled down and had kids. So I did plenty of exhibit development without it, to be fair. And I brought a lot of other people's children's in to test out models that I was making to see if I was on the right track. But did having kids affect what I thought about exhibits and programs after that? Absolutely. And in some ways, it's not always good, right? I have to remind myself that even though I may have handed something over to my 5-year-old to test it out while I was at home that night.
Not all 5-year-olds are going to respond the same way.
Right. I have an N of 1, right? That's not good data, right? So on the one hand, it definitely gives me perspective, but it's the same kind of perspective that any exhibit or program developer can get by studying child development. So in some ways, you have to embrace how much you've learned as a parent. And then also when you're developing a program or an exhibit for family learning or for a child to use, that your particular experience as a parent or as a child doesn't necessarily mean that it's, the majority that you're designing an exhibit for. So it's great, and it made it a little harder.
Okay, interesting. I'm not sure if this is too personal, and we can certainly strike it, but are your kids homeschooled, being that both of you, you and Charles, have an education and background? I'm sorry, background in education?
So they're definitively not homeschooled because we have a background in education. And we believe in the public school system, for better or for worse. We're strong advocates for our public schools. And there were 2 years where my daughter went to middle school at a private school, and Charles taught at a private school for a little while. But no, we actually initially expected to move to Cleveland and have the kids in Cleveland schools. And let's just say I'm not a very patient house hunter. So it was a lot faster for me to quickly find a place in Shaker Heights. And we've loved being there. And our kids, I've been in Shaker schools for all but 2 years for one of my children, and all years for our youngest. And we feel pretty firmly that there are lots of things that you can supplement as a parent, and you can provide a great learning experience at home. And there's so much that a child gets out of a school experience that we wouldn't want to have our kids miss that. And fortunately, each of our children were a good fit for the public school system. Not every child is. And
are you speaking to neurodivergence and things like that?
Well, my youngest is neurodivergent.
Okay.
He's pretty open about it, that he's autistic. And in fact, we found that he was best served in a public school system. We tried a private school, did not work well. But in fact, public school in Shaker schools had constant support, that so many of the things that prior to that we were having to every day after school take him to get all sorts of different occupational therapy and other coaching, that they were able to provide in school.
Wow,
and
that's
so
really wonderful.
For a neurodivergent child, homeschooling or a private school would have been a horrible idea for our child. I'm sure, 100% sure, there are neurodivergent children where homeschooling is the best option. But for ours, it was not. We have 2 very different children, and public school served both of them fabulously.
Wow. So Kirsten, if your organization had all the money in the world, what are the top 3 expenditures it would make to achieve your vision? And what is your vision?
Well, let me take the first part of that question. If we had all the money in the world, you start with staff, because they're the heart and soul of what we do at Great Lakes Science Center. And we've done so much to improve things for staff over the last 10 years. We've done salary studies and a lot of work to make sure, we started a minimum salary for part-time and minimum salary for full-time, things like that. But I still look, this is something we talk about pretty regularly with HR, and I still look and I think, okay, can we do better? Benefits are one example. I was in a discussion group with nonprofit leaders recently, and someone said, well, how many of you pay 100% of the health insurance costs? And of course, not everybody raised their hand, but the number of organizations where they said they did cover 100% of all the costs, that there was, no monthly cost to the employees, inspired me to think like, yep, that's an area where we can do better. We still haven't found any carrier that will give health insurance to our part-time employees because we're too small of an organization. And so things like that, if money were no object, I'd take care of all of that, and I'd take care of it first.
That's really beautiful.
So that said, then second, I'd just say, there are two investments that are harder to raise funds for, right? We spend a lot of time fundraising in the community. We're about 60% earned revenue, like what people spend when they come to the Science Center. But then the remaining 40% is contributed revenue, and we have a lot of support in the community. But two things it's harder to get support for, and the one of those is infrastructure. So we have to replace our elevators, and we've been saving up to do that, and it's terribly expensive, and we've just got enough saved, and we're going to head into doing that. And if we could just wave a magic wand and have all those sorts of infrastructure things taken care of. We're 28 years old now as an organization and as a building. And that means that as much as it's a fantastically built structure with a lot of forethought about how it could be used as a museum, and a lot of brilliant things put in place, I would love to run through and just take care of every single infrastructure thing, because it then reduces your operating costs on a regular basis.
And you guys have multiple elevators
and escalators.
And each one can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Exactly. And I would like to get rid of all of those escalators and put in some beautiful, fun elevators.
Like glass
That's
encasing.
it, exactly.
Yeah, okay,
Right,
yeah.
right. So I'd wave a magic wand and get that done. Just take care of fixing, the constant upkeep on a parking garage. Talk about unsexy expenses. I can't fundraise for that, really.
Right.
So infrastructure is the second thing. And then the third thing that is also harder but possible to raise funds for is the endowment. And we're in Cleveland, right? Go up the road to the Cleveland Museum of Art. Now, it's hard in Cleveland because Great Lakes Science Center is 28 years old. We're around a lot of museums that have been here for 100 years, more than 100 years. And you look at their endowment, and certainly the Cleveland Museum of Art is extraordinary, with an endowment, depending on how the market is going, that reaches $1 billion. That's
Wow.
with a B, yeah.
Wow.
But when you look at other organizations like Natural History Museum, the History Center, places like that have been around for a long time, they have endowments in place that allow them to draw down just the annual, like 4%. And that covers, 50, 60, 70% of their annual operating costs, which reduces the stress on the organization, reduces the, worry about, are we doing things that are immediately appealing to people? And it allows them to take a little more risk.
Right.
So after I got staff and infrastructure taken care of with this endless pot of money, I'd build up that endowment to make sure that we didn't have to stress on a regular basis for the basics to be covered. And those are the three big things. Now, then if you want to go from there, I can tell you about all sorts of things we could do to build out a world-class NASA Glenn Visitor Center with Mars and moonscapes that you could drive a buggy over, or immersive rooms where you would feel like you were at the bottom of the blue abyss pool doing scientific research, or astronaut training that we could have set up. There's a lot that we could do with our NASA Glenn Visitor Center. in the next iteration, that if money was no object, we would have people coming from all over the world to try their hand at the kind of experiences we could offer there.
I hope this podcast can help you advocate in some way for that, because that just sounds incredible. Man, that would be amazing if like we could do. Are you suggesting like the exhibit would be something where people would come in and almost get an astronaut training as if they were?
Exactly, where we could do, you can fly to Huntsville for things like this. You can go to Kennedy or Houston. We could be the fourth in Cleveland.
Wow.
People don't know how much NASA Glenn does. If you want to go to the moon or Mars, you've got to go through Cleveland because of the research and the testing that NASA Glenn does. Bringing that to life and then showing off all of the surrounding companies, like Blue Abyss is a good example of that, who's just coming to town and building one of the world's largest pools to do research that is the closest you can get to near zero gravity,
Yeah.
right? They've got one in Houston. It's used to train astronauts, but you also can do research and experiments at that depth of a pool. And so imagine walking into a huge room that's one of these immersive projection rooms, and you're able to interact with things and do experiments. So, that future iteration of the NASA Glenn Visitor Center could really become this whole other structure attached to the Science Center, part of that Science Center experience. And you could train to be an astronaut, a researcher, drive across what feels like the moon's surface.
Wow.
All of it would be possible.
Knock, knock. Sherwin-Williams, Cardinal Health. May I introduce you to Dr. Ellenbogen?
We'll be fundraising for that in the future, not to worry. We're going to get through our current campaign, and then we'll dive into exciting things like that.
That's incredible. I hope you're able to get the funding for that. Let's see, we're running a little low on time, so I'd like to wrap up by, well, not quite wrap up, but before we wrap up, rather, I'd like to ask you, what is the legacy you'd like to leave behind during your tenure as the CEO of the Great Lakes Science Center?
Well, I'd say probably three things. The first is financial stability. When I was hired, that was something that the organization was really looking for. The board certainly was looking for that. And we as a team, the staff, the board, the community, have made that organization a financially strong organization. It's a wonderful position to be in now. And it is my legacy. I'm very proud of it. Second thing is the shift to the in-house leadership. And I mean that for the exhibits and the programs both. Science centers often go down this path of constantly renting external exhibits. And one of the things we've been able to do is take much more of control of that ourselves and start to build things that are uniquely ours, right? So Tapescape, the international tape station that opens Memorial Day and runs through Labor Day is another example of that. But every year you see examples of that. Things that we build that are uniquely Cleveland, uniquely Great Lakes Science Center. And
can you then rent those out?
You build things in a very different way to rent them out. And there are quite a few, there are multiple science centers that have gone through serious financial difficulty because they jumped into the traveling exhibit business model. It's a tough business to run, and you're competing against places that work with Disney and frankly, places that create exhibits that we don't want to have. I mean, I don't want the science of Harry Potter at Great Lakes Science Center because there's so much great science in Northeast Ohio. We should be focusing on that. So every once in a while we do one of those blockbusters, but that's not the norm anymore. And that's a legacy I'm very proud of. Third and final thing I would say is just really the organization changing the way it values its staff. That's something I've worked really hard on. Our staff retention has changed. Our staff leadership has changed. When we lose staff, we just lost some staff, and those were good examples. They went on to become, go off and be at the vice president level somewhere else. And that's a fantastic thing. If we become known as an organization that develops staff internally from part-time positions, one of the people that just left, really worked their way up over quite a few years and is now moved into a vice president position. That's the kind of legacy I'd love to have. I'd love it if we have that reputation as a place that develops leaders for the whole field.
Right, and it's not the old school nonprofit narrative where you're overworked and underpaid.
Exactly.
Totally.
Exactly. That narrative has got to go.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I want to, before we let you go, I want to ask you, because we met through Superior Pho, how did you hear about Superior Pho?
Well, I love pho. Everywhere I've lived, I've always had a favorite spot for pho. Even my first day in Cleveland, when I came to interview, I had a great moment where I was given a couple hours to go take a break and get lunch, and went and had pho. And let me tell you, that was a lot of making me feel like, oh, I can be at home here. Oh. And I can't remember who first told me about Superior Pho, but I will tell you that, especially in my first years, it meant a lot to me to have either donors or board members and colleagues where I'd say, well, let me take you to my favorite place, because that was Superior Pho. And coming here and having someone you can bring and sit down and, talk over an incredible bowl of pho, it's a great feeling.
And what do you usually get when you're here?
Oh, I get the number 2.
Oh, the number 2. Okay.
That's my favorite.
High round.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. How do you dress it up? Are you pretty plain Jane or?
Well, I have to say the broth here, and we'll have to do a whole nother podcast where I interview you about all the rumors of a mother broth and all of those great things. The broth here is unbelievable. I don't know how you do it. And I'm someone who does have a lot of fun in a lot of different places over time and places, but I do like to usually have it as is, like respect for...
Perfect.
Yeah, respect for the chef. Now, that said, sometimes I break tradition and I need that chicken. I need the chicken noodle soup.
Yeah.
And so when I get pho, I do dress that up. And oh, yeah. I mean, who doesn't love, a blast of sriracha in the soup? It's a nice dress up, especially when you get the chicken.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start... over the past year, we've slowed things down to do them the way we sort of originally did them. So even more now than ever than maybe the past few years prior, we've slowed down the way we do our broth. Everything is slow cooked to perfection, so to speak, and we're really proud of that. We now do it again. The way my grandmother intended for it to be done. And we're really, really excited about that. So just hearing this type of feedback, it always warms my heart. It really does. So thank you for joining us today. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Chris. It's a treat. This place means a lot to me, and it's wonderful to just get to talk to you.
Yeah, well, your presence means a lot to us. And I just remember the first time we met, and you told me, because sometimes I make conversation with people here, and that's the whole premise of this podcast is all the fascinating people. But the first time we met, and you told me, well, I'm the CEO of the Great Lakes Science Center. Internally, I was going crazy. I was fanboying because, you grew up, the Great Lakes Science Center, I think you told me since 1996. I was still a boy. And even at that time, before your time there as CEO, it's kind of like Cleveland's own piece of magic. It's our own. I don't want to compare it to Disney, but it's kind of like that. Feeling of excitement and awe and wonder, and then to have the person who makes it all happen. And I know you have your team, you know, but to have the person who pulls it all together under our roof, dining with us, it's an incredible feeling. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And folks, this was Chris Wynn from Superior Pho with Dr. Kirsten Ellenbogen, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find us on all of the major platforms: Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all of our social media, Instagram, X, TikTok. Until next time, Kirsten, thank you for joining us and sharing a bowl with Superior Pho.
My pleasure.